Sydney, Dunedin, New Zealand, and animals from Bangladesh. Mohammed, where are you? Syria. Yeah, lovely.
Okay, I think we're just about ready. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge and I'm the convener of the Social Capital Research Group. Our group promotes the advancement of social capital theories and we support anyone who wants to use the concept in research and practical applications. We have members from about 130 different countries. We have an active discussion group with over 1,000 members and we hold regular webinars from invited speakers and PhD students. In this session, we welcome Professor Tyge Payne for a presentation and discussion about social capital and family entrepreneurship. Tyge Payne is the H. Norman Surridge Jr. and Community Coffee Company, Inc. Chair of Entrepreneurship in the Stevenson Department of Entrepreneurship and Family Systems at Louisiana State University. Professor Payne has published work at the intersection of entrepreneurship and strategic management for more than 80 times, including publications in top journals. I'm sure anyone familiar with social capital literature has read his excellent co-authored article, Multi-Level Challenges and Opportunities in Social Capital Research, that was published in the Journal of Management in 2011. It is an excellent discussion of how social capital has been empirically applied across different levels of analysis, and I strongly recommend it if you haven't already read it. Dr. Payne recently completed a 3-year term as the editor-in-chief of the Family Business Review, which is the leading journal dedicated to the study of family business. Welcome, Tyge, and over to you.
Thank you, Tristan. Thank you for having me, and hello to everyone out there. I'm glad to see so many people showing up, no matter what time of day it is. For me, I have the privilege of having a 2 p.m. Date time, so I'm pretty happy with having a nice sunny afternoon outside. Feel free anywhere along the way if you want to stop me, have a question, you have a comment. We'd like this to be much more of a discussion as opposed to just a monologue. I did prepare some slides just to kind of get the conversation moving, but that's kind of I'd much rather us be engaged in discussing new ideas than just you hearing from me. Makes it a lot less difficult for me to go through this. So I just wanted to start with kind of giving a little of my background. Hopefully that would give you some ideas about where I'm coming from as far as my interests, and then also how those interests meet with my research and my teaching as well. So my background, I was raised in a small town of West Texas, which West Texas is an arid, dry land, a desert, a high desert, and I have lived in that area for most of my life. I recently moved to Louisiana just to get a new perspective, change of scenery, basically a good opportunity to work with some good entrepreneurship scholars. And so I've moved from kind of my small town, West Texas roots to a bigger metropolis. I'm about an hour away from New Orleans, which most people know about. And, it's kind of been a refreshing change. My undergraduate degree was actually in pharmacy. So I come from a hard science background, but that was basically because I was raised, my dad was a pharmacist and I was raised in this family business of pharmacy. And so my interest in family business kind of emerged from there, but it didn't really take hold until much later, after I was out past my PhD. I got an MBA and then a PhD, both from Texas Tech University. So why social capital? I was thinking about that. I haven't really thought about this too much, but I would say that my initial interest started from my advisor. His name was John Blair, and he did a lot of, he was out of Michigan and did a lot of work in with stakeholder theory. And so when I was working with him, a lot of things were based on stakeholder, and he used to make these crazy big stakeholder maps, which now I understand were much more like networks, right? He was really a network theorist. He just didn't really know that's what it was at the time, and he called it stakeholder theory, and that's since evolved. And but that was some of my early interests. My interests were in configurations theory, agency theory, contingency theory. And then I developed this interest in social capital. All of these theoretical perspectives, I enjoy because they, I guess, speak to me. Everybody has their kind of favorite theoretical perspectives because they make some kind of sense, right? So they speak to you in some way that other theories don't, or they explain things that you're interested in where other perspectives don't. And so social capital was one of those. And I was telling Tristan this a little bit before we started all this, that the paper that he referenced, this 2011 Journal of Management review paper, was one of my first forays into that, into social capital. But it was actually, it actually emerged in these two papers that were much later. My friend and writing partner, Kurt Moore here, he kind of got me interested in these things. We started up these two projects. Interestingly enough, these two projects started about in 2010, well, maybe 2009, before we actually did this paper. And it was our discussions about these two papers, these two projects, that stimulated us to say, well, we need to first dig into social capital from a multi-level perspective. And that stimulated this paper, this review paper, from the outset. So unfortunately for many of you PhD students out there, the reality is sometimes projects take 10 years to actually see the light of day. And so you can have some that maybe started much earlier, but don't get published until much later, depending on how things go. So the interest came phenomenologically here, but then the review came here, and we worked on these for multiple years off and on until we finally got them to a position where we could get them published in good journals. So this particular one was working with network organizations and looking at project-based activities. Both of these used a data set that was based out of the Texas Department of Transportation, and we were looking at road construction companies and how they used contractors, subcontractors in the bidding process that they went through, which made it a very interesting context, but it was actually a slow kind of couple of projects. So those areas where I was looking at networks and social capital and building on our ideas, I really became fascinated with the multi-level aspect of social capital. And you'll see that kind of entering into what we're going to kind of talk about today, which is family business. I started developing some interest in family business as a area of research because I came from that, but I also saw that it was really something that there were a lot of people out there that were in family businesses, but we didn't have a lot of research that really developed some of the problems or issues that family businesses were going through, despite family business being the biggest organizational form in the world. I mean, there's estimations that we can have as many as 80% of all business organizations are family owned and operated. So it's a prevalent organizational form, but we really didn't have that much dedicated to that, and we slowly continue to make some progress in that area. But family business has, to me, been really an interesting context to which to think about social capital. So I'm going to talk a lot about what I put forth in this recent book chapter with one of my doctoral students, Nathan Hayes, and just hopefully through our discussions, we can talk about social capital, entrepreneurship, and family businesses, and this intersection that they have. And maybe that will stimulate some discussions about new research projects, maybe practical applications, consulting issues, whatever you're interested in talking about. So for just a kind of introduction, the family and the business are linked, right? They're historically linked. The family is arguably, and I would think this is, I can't see how somebody could disprove this, but the oldest social unit, right? The family started first. So as you have a family, it's the oldest social unit. And that's basically makes them an important part of all of our lives. And there's also this innate connection that we have, that we're tied to people either biologically or genealogically or socially over time, that makes us family. And that's a strong network of people that is very important in most of our lives, right? But the other part of that is because families are so important, they become closely tied to businesses in most situations. So a couple of facts in the US anyway, the family business accounts for about 83 million jobs, 7.7 trillion of the GDP, and 87% of all tax-paying businesses. And this was an estimate. And the other part of that is the US is probably on the lower side compared to most countries. So if it makes up this big of a component of the US, then there's many other countries out there with much higher influence of family businesses. So the point being that the family and the business are linked together, and from that multi-level perspective, the family is a unit, a social unit, and the business is a social unit, and those two get slapped together, they're embedded, and that makes for a very unique and complex social issue that I find very, very fascinating. So the family business research has looked at this issue of social capital in family business before. Some people have called this concept familyness. So looking at the firm level, they call it familyness, meaning it's the degree to which resources and capabilities are bundled together as a result of the systems as a result of these systems that interact, so family and business, right? So there's this kind of perspective that the degree of familyness is a firm level perspective, but it's built on this resources and capabilities that come from the family and business interaction. Chrisman, 2003, Chu and Litz described the construct as resources and capabilities related to family involvement and interactions. So family business or familyness started with kind of an RBV kind of perspective. So a resource-based kind of view led it to be these results of these bundles of resources and capabilities. Pearson, Carr, and Shaw in 2008 brought this forward and used a social capital lens. And they talked about this more as less of distinct entities between family and business and more about how they're enmeshed in complex web of relationships. So the resulting resources and capabilities that come from familyness or are described as familyness are a result from the synergies that are contained within the two systems. So that was one perspective. Another perspective was what was called family social capital. And this was, I don't think, not Argyle, Hitt, Sermon, Very. They looked at this less as a synergistic kind of thing at the firm level and more of two different types or social groups that have a separate social capital or separate networks, separate social capital, but they intersect. So they discussed the family as just one of many types of social groups that coexist in an organization, and that this group influences the organization's social capital. So they're different levels of analysis, but they're integrated. And they talked about the antecedents that lead to social capital being stability, interaction, interdependence, and closure. So in this case, they look at social capital from a family and an organizational perspective and how those are interlinked with one another. So in this little book chapter, we spelled out this this figure, and this was based off of another paper that I co-authored with several people, but it basically put out a schema that kind of helped me personally identify areas for research, or areas that create problems. So if you look in here at the top, this is a multi-level kind of perspective. We got individual issues, family-based issues, and business-based issues. So family has its own, or the individual has its own relationships and network. The individual has his or her own social capital and his or her own entrepreneurial outcomes. Those are embedded within the family that has those same three things, and the business that have those same three aspects to it, which makes for a complex web of relationships. These are just connections that can go up and down levels of analysis and make the whole ordeal of dealing with family business a very complex one. So flows from one to the other can be two-way. I kind of have drawn this from a left to right kind of causal kind of perspective, but the reality is you can have two-way flows almost in all of these situations. You could have an individual that influences the family social capital, but you could probably have family social capital that influences the individual network. There's feedbacks and such. But in general, we think from a temporal perspective, you go in from establishing a network of relationships that leads to the attainment or potential attainment of some kind of capital, and then that leads to certain outcomes. So the flows are potentially both ways, and not all of these flows necessarily are positive flows. We think about them in terms, or I think about them in terms largely of information, knowledge. Those types of things are easier, but that can be good information or bad information, for instance, that flows from one aspect to another. Also, the types and strengths of these relationships are different. Every family business, every organization, every individual these are different. So understanding the nature of these is very complex. And then the issues of mechanisms. How do we take mechanisms that turn these networks into social capital and then into actions that kind of end up in here between this box and this box, actions that result in outcomes? And those are like the interesting intersections that I see in the family business, which make it just really fascinating to think about and study. Excuse me. And also useful in terms of consulting as well.
So I can just come in here, just a couple of questions, if we can pause just for a moment. I had a question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to what you see the social capital in that middle box there, what the social capital is, because I think you've talked about the way in which networks and relationships are basically, it's a source of social capital. The way in which actions are an outcome or a step towards the outcomes of social capital. So if you could talk a little bit about what you think social capital is in that middle section.
Okay. Yeah. So my perspective has always been, or I've always felt like that there's kind of a disconnect between what people talk about in terms of what is a network or a relationship versus what is social capital. We get those things confused quite often. And it's always helped me to think about the network as the pattern or structures of relationships. So we have relationships. And then the social capital is those resources or capabilities that we gain from the nature of that network. So I look at social capital as actually capital, like real things that you get. For instance, information. So the network is the source of the information. The social capital is the actual information that I receive from my network, or the potential to be able to get that. So I always looked at social capital as something more tangible, I guess, whereas the network is more about the structure or the nature of the ties or relationships that we have. A lot of times, especially more people that are, say, they're network theorists, will kind of skip over this. They'll go from network to outcome and skip what is it in the middle that we're getting. And I might even skip over things in this particular drawing about what is between the actual, say, information or knowledge that I have. Maybe it's human capital, maybe it's knowledge, whatever. How does that get put into an action here that actually leads to outcomes? So these steps that we get kind of get confusing and lost, in particularly in our empirical or more quantitative type of studies. Did that answer your question at all?
Yeah, I think it did. So the social capital, so information is one example of that kind of resource or benefit, fairly tangible form of capital. Is there a list of other forms of benefit that are social capital other than information?
I think I've probably at somewhere along the way given more examples, but one of them would be simply financial capital, right? That you could gain from the nature of your network. Financial capital, information, knowledge, reputation, status, which was something we've looked at before. Things like that some of them could be tangible, some of them could be intangible, but they are the result of or gained through the network of relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we don't really need a list as long as we know what we're talking about, which is that they're those productive, beneficial outcomes of social relationships. Sounds like what you're talking about. Yeah,
exactly. And there is also that aspect that people have talked about, dark social capital, right? So the negative implications that could come from that. So you may get a negative reputation based on the network of relationships that you have. So or bad, bad information or other things like that.
Yeah. And there was also a question in the chat from Aminul from Bangladesh asking if you could elaborate a little bit about family business in China. I'm not sure if Aminul wants to come on and maybe ask that question a bit more specifically. Aminul might be on mute. Tyge, do you want to talk a little bit to that?
I can try. I'm certainly no expert on family businesses in China, but from my perspective, the basic relationships tend to be the same. I think what would be uniquely different about family businesses in China is just the historical nature of how ingrained families are with one another. In the US, we might be much more likely to separate from a family. We may have the independence or freedom to be able to do that, whereas the expectations in China might be that you stay within the family, and that the hierarchy is more established and uniform, and family members may have less option to do their own thing or to break out or to stay maintained. But the basic ideas, I think, are still pretty prevalent between the close-knit nature of the social relationships in family businesses or in families, and then those permeate to the family business. Although it may be less equal among the family members, so you may have more patriarchal kind of a situation where one family member kind of dominates the family.
I think what you're talking about is, that social capital theories are often widely applicable across different cultural contexts. It's just that the context in which it operates can be very different, but the general theory seems to be widely applicable.
Yes, very well stated. That's exactly right.
All right, shall we move on with the presentation? Everyone, feel free to continue to add any questions you have in the chat, and we can pause as we go along.
All right. So the next kind of slide shows one other aspect that I've been thinking more fully about. I haven't really developed my ideas well yet, but the issue that one of the things that is growing in interest in the family business realm, which is applicable, is the notion that we're not just talking about single family businesses, but we're talking about more business families. So families that have multiple businesses that they kind of oversee in different areas, which adds another level of complexity. So you notice that my chair is held by the Siraj family, which is the owners of a community coffee. So they're a Starbucks-like, more regional coffee company, and they're not small by any means, but they are much more regional, not global. But they are arranged much more like this second representation than the first. So in the first, you have a family that is kind of the nucleus of the business, and all the family is involved with the key business. And then you have external core members that are but not family members, and then you got core non-family outsiders. Now, you could have an outside family member that's not part of the family or the business, but most of the time you see this kind of traditional view, and that's kind of the perspective we most often take. More so, we see in kind of more modern times, we see this family being not the nucleus, but more like the overseeing social unit that manages the businesses. And you may have family members that are in 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 businesses, and as the family gets older, more generations tied on, this number of businesses tends to grow. So that community coffee company that I'm referring to, they're starting their 5th generation. So they have networks of cousins, that go all over the place, and some of them are involved with the business, some of them are not, but all of them maintain some ownership, and that comes within the family. So they may not be even doing anything with the businesses, but they may be part of the family doing things like philanthropy, nonprofit kind of situations. So the family has its own organization that is tied, but relatively more loosely, to each of the businesses. So to me, it's an interesting concept to start thinking about the family as an organizational unit that has businesses that are tied to it, but yet it's not this traditional view that that we've kind of come to understand and think about in terms of family business. So there's a whole mess of questions and opportunities for study or for consulting that deals with this more complex web of relationships and how the social capital is utilized and managed in this kind of situation. I'm reading the chat here.
I'm keeping an eye on it, but
Okay. So these kind of issues are important to me, or I think they're important everywhere, because the family relationships, they're idiosyncratic, but most families, and this will vary, but they share really strong norms, values, visions, purposes, goals, and that makes them a very strong social unit that can potentially have a really big impact on the development of social capital, not just for the family, but also for organizations, their businesses, and maybe even other firms. So the idea that the family can be a major component in the development of social capital that then leads itself to entrepreneurial competitive advantages for the firm. And arguably, these what we often talk about is what the difference between family and non-family firms actually is. It may actually be this ability or presence of creating strong familial based networks that then lead to very strong important social capital aspects. So I just kind of feel like that there's this area of research and that is really being hadn't been fully investigated yet, especially as things are changing in the kind of dynamic environment that we're in. So I had a couple of questions, not necessarily for us to answer per se, but just kind of food for thought, and some things. I'll throw out some basic early ideas that I've had about this, and then we can discuss. First question is, how can family leaders best utilize social networks? That being at the multi-level, individual, group, or family level, and the organizational level, to gain access to resources that are needed in the pursuit of opportunity. So I'm really focusing in on the kind of idea of opportunity and entrepreneurship. One, because I really believe that's the name of the game moving forward. The world is changing so fast. There's lots of things going on. You kind of got to move with it, change and adapt, look for new opportunity, or you're going to get left behind. So it's a really important aspect of things. And then the second question is, how can social capital be transformed into entrepreneurial activities and outcomes? So that kind of black box thing that I even noticed in my own kind of thinking is, we talk about social capital, we talk about outcomes, but we don't talk about the intervening mechanisms or processes that take and use those resources and capabilities and turn them into actual actions or tactics. And so what mechanisms can facilitate opportunity detection, willingness to pursue opportunity, and confidence, et cetera, to move forward? So both of these questions are kind of academic, but also practitioner in their basis. So in that book chapter, we put together, and I won't go through these in detail, but we kind of put together some basic tactics, like actions that would be kind of trying to kind of stimulate a phenomenologically based idea between connecting social capital to certain kinds of entrepreneurial outcomes. So internal kind of perspective, or more of a bonding perspective, is like things like encouraging employees and family members to bring up new ideas or be creative. How do you incentivizing opportunity in a traditional work setting? Structured teams involving family and non-family. How do you change these teams regularly? Do you do new tasks? Social activities. How do you engage people in more social activities so we build and that those bonding mechanisms to create new things? Externally, looking for how do you bring in outside people? One of the challenges for family businesses is often they get insulated, and they only promote from within. The family members only are the ones that make the big decisions. But that really works against them in a lot of ways. And so how do you bring in outsiders into and engage them so that you can stimulate new ideas, develop new knowledge, etc. So temporary workers, consultants, key positions within the company, outsiders are important for that. Engaging in external entities, trade shows, conferences, looking for you outside ties, outside of just the business, things like churches, social units, clubs, and then increase in interaction, engagement with the company of stakeholders, suppliers, etc. So the idea basically is there are some specific actions or activities that we know would create social capital, and then also there are tactics that or changes that you can make to the organization that utilize social capital to ultimately lead to actions that can result in positive outcomes. So looking more into those things, being specific about that study. So kind of to leave us kind of towards the end, and then we can open this up to just discussions, question and answers, thoughts. I was just thinking about our trends for the future. There's been a lot of talk about family demographics that are changing. People are living longer. People are having less children. There's an aging workforce that we're seeing that's problematic in a lot of countries, China being one of those. There's a changing kind of definition of quote unquote what is a family. There's a lot of people that aren't in a traditional kind of family situation. So what does that mean to the creation of social capital, how we utilize social capital in the business setting? Environmental and sustainability issues, societies, governments, industries, even families are more concerned about the environment and sustainability than they have ever been before. What does that mean? All right, so how does that work with social capital and the outcomes that we see? One of the keys for family business is a key issue that we're dealing with is called social emotional wealth. Some of you may have heard that term, but that's basically the idea that non-economic factors may be and often are more important to family business than the economic factors. And this is where that kind of comes in. We're seeing a lot of families that have a lot of wealth becoming much more interested in non-economic factors than economic factors. And how do you use that for the organization and to better the family? Future work, digitization, AI, automation, robotics, work from home. All of these are changing the dynamics, not just in business, but also in the family. And considering those kind of things together, family and business, what does that mean? How does that change our structures of what we do, our work environment, and the outcomes that we see? And then finally, societal trends, global prosperity, living standards, longevity have all increased. It's kind of related to the first, but there's also there's a lot of disparity between the rich and the poor. There's some changes in how people view economics, what we should be doing from a political perspective. So there's a lot of issues that kind of go into those questions that I believe a lot of these can be addressed, answered, or at least studied using a social capital perspective. And a lot of these have to do with families. And there's an intersection there that really makes a lot of sense to me, something that we could look at as both academics, practitioners, both. It's an important area. So I guess closing kind of comment, innovatively adapting to a fast changing environment is the key to business in modern days. It's just things are changing. We need to adapt, change, be innovative. And I think social capital is a key component to survival. And I will add on to that, particularly for family businesses, because often they tend to be I don't want to say stuck in the past, but they do tend to have a little bit longer term perspective. They tend to put a lot of weight on tradition, and sometimes that can lead to being less willing to adapt and change moving forward. All right, so that's kind of what I had. I'm completely open to discussion or talk or questions, whatever.
Thanks, Doug. I'm sure there's going to be quite a lot of questions. I've got one question. That black box that exists between social capital and the outcomes of social capital, it seems to me that social capital theories don't have a lot of answers there. There's not a lot of ability to explain the processes that are going on that might cause it. But I think within various social theories, there are some potentially really useful concepts that could be brought into social capital theory that might help. And one that comes to mind for me is something like social identity theory. That can help to explain, in-group and out-group effects and all of these kinds of things. Are you aware of, or have you thought about what kinds of sociological theories might be useful?
It's funny you say that, because social identity was something that I just kind of recently had a little bit of an aha moment with, and I was thinking exactly that same thing. Other than that, I haven't come across anything that I really thought, oh, that really makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, I recognize that it's an issue. And I think that's kind of, I was talking to one of my doctoral students the other day, and we were talking about how come there hasn't been more progress in terms of social capital. There's been a lot of studies and a lot of interest, but from a theoretical perspective, I haven't seen, and I could be missing things, but I haven't seen a lot of really big movements in what we say or do or think about social capital. And I think that's part of the issue. We haven't brought in some alternative perspectives that kind of fill in some of those holes. I think that's kind of the challenge, but I don't really have a lot of answers at this time.
Well, and it does seem like one of those challenges, because social capital is so interdisciplinary that there might be some really valuable lessons like social identity theory potentially coming out of social psychology or psychology that might be really useful. But I think it's difficult for a lot of researchers on social capital to bring in those theories and to meaningfully give them treatment unless they have some familiarity with something like social psychology. And there might be other theories as well coming from other disciplines that might be quite relevant. And I guess this is where yourself in management, being very multidisciplinary, it could be a really good opportunity to try and bring in some of those theories and maybe they can help to sort of unpack that black box a little bit.
Yes, I totally agree. And that's I guess that's where as I've thought about this over the last month or so, it's just, I've come to the conclusion that, I only have limited time. So you throw it out there, and hopefully some young scholar with a lot of energy can come through and make a big contribution, because I just like, I've got a lot of questions, but I haven't been able to have the time or I don't know, the ability to spend time answering those questions.
Yeah, I think like one way to think about this is that social capital relates in many ways to the question of human cooperation. Why are humans cooperative? And this is one of the key challenges of the social sciences. It's kind of been identified as one of those main challenges that's relevant across so many different disciplines. And I think thinking about it in that way, then that it really does help us to understand how complex it is and how we don't have a lot of answers to these kinds of things, and how we probably do need to take very multidisciplinary approaches to try to understand what's happening in that black box. So perhaps not give us such a hard time about there being a black box, I suppose.
Right, right.
But also,
well, if we knew what all the black boxes had in them, then we wouldn't have a job, I don't think. So
indeed, true, absolutely. And I think like another big part of that black box must be norms and normative influence. And again, that's an area that quite a lot of research has been done and work's been done particularly within sociology. So it's another area that potentially could be brought in and help us to uncover and understand some of those processes a little more. Shall we? What questions do we have, Marion, in the chat? I think you had one.
Well, yeah, I've got 1,000. I'm not going to ask 1,000.
Let's start with one from you.
Well, I did post one about the generational, third and fifth generational issue, but I just thought I'd put that question into context in terms of strategy. My big question, I work in Western Sydney, where there is many family businesses. In the School of Business, we actually have many of the second generation of new migrant businesses coming through. And so we see these dilemmas that are going on for this generation in terms of going forward. I worked with a student that was just about to go and work for a significant organisation that his father owned, and I looked at we scrounged around and looked at strategies around. Anyway, it's a big research area, but we struck on sort of open strategy of sort of trying to adopt a much more open strategic view of the organisation. Do you think there's some leverage in that kind of view? I'm just trying to be advising some of these in a practical sense, some of these new generations that are coming through and inheriting these large organisations of how to drive change strategically through the business. And open strategy kind of does it a little bit. Do you think?
Okay, so I guess I'm trying to get exactly what the question is. Do I think that a strategic perspective applied to these family businesses is an appropriate one? Is that basically it?
Yeah, I guess that is. And okay. Bringing in lots of networks and lots of information through opening up the strategy a bit more.
Yes, I think I'm first and foremost, I'm a strategic management kind of scholar. So that's kind of where my background came from. And I'm a firm believer in the strategic management process. So anytime if I personally go and consult any kind of organization, but particularly family businesses, I think it's really important to kind of break down the kind of strategic management process for them, because a lot of the second and third generation, they'll have grown up in the business and they haven't had much experience outside of that. So they end up getting blinders on in a lot of times because they've seen it done one way and they're not really open to how things have been done in other areas or taking different viewpoints. So kind of allowing them to see some of that kind of more open and breaking kind of the mold of this is how we've done it always is really enlightening for them. And then also it tends to engage them more if they think that they can have a creative process and be involved in the organization beyond kind of what dad or granddad or grandmom did. And I think that's a very important aspect of it. So I guess the answer is yes. I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. But a lot of it involves getting them in the room together and working through a process themselves so that they can kind of get a feel for what is being done that may be different than what they thought was being done, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There's in the strategy practice field. Sorry, I teach strategy as well. So and leadership. So the issue becomes that third and fifth generation as well. When you actually sort of look at it, and when you're sort of looking at businesses that fail, they tend to be on the third or fifth generation. So there's lots of research within the strategic area that I think that can actually get linked in here. So do you think so too?
Yes, and one of the biggest problems going from like second to third, and then even third, fourth, fifth, and just add on, they are forced typically to become more professional. So they have to have more professional systems in place. They have to have kind of more merit-based processes and structures and things like that. So that professionalization of the organization is very important, especially second to third generation, where you're getting more and more people involved, but they don't have the processes, the structures in place that a non-family business would already have in place. So I think that's extremely important.
Okay, thank you. We'll keep on talking about that, but somebody, sorry, I've just been.
I think Garda Solomon might have a question. Feel free to unmute yourself now if you would like to pose your question. They were unmuted while you were talking, but there was a little bit of background noise, so I muted them. Feel free, Garda Solomon, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. No, may not be here. We could move on to Aminal. Aminal, do you want to ask your question?
Yep.
Yes, I asked my question too. How do you think about future thoughts on family business that may include social business theory, existing social business theory? Am I clear?
Yeah, okay. So family business that may include social business theory. I guess I'm not sure exactly what you mean by social business theory, or is that just
it was introduced by Professor Dr. Yunus, social business theory.
I guess I'm not familiar with what social business theory is. Are you talking about like the role that like
it was introduced by Professor Dr. Muhammad Yunus, Nobel laureate.
Are we talking about social enterprises?
Yes.
Oh, so like social ventures? Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
One of the things I've seen, and this is as much through the academic world as it is through just my interaction with family businesses, is their increasing interest from families in any kind of social agenda, right, or social outcome, which is forcing them, or not forcing, but incentivizing some of them to try to combine their business interests with their social interests, and they're starting of not just for-profit business ventures, but also nonprofit business ventures, and then engaging in a lot of philanthropy. So I think the future of family business is going to go a lot in that direction, especially as we get more and more of these extended multi-generational families that have multiple businesses. They're looking for outlets, not only for their children or children's children to be engaged, but they're looking to do good. So they are sitting on a good bit of wealth, many of them, and they're trying to find ways to be engaged. But social venturing is a big part of all business right now. Just that changing trend where people are more and more concerned about society, the environment, those types of issues. They're looking for ways to combine both the social aspect and the economic aspect together in a single business entity. And in some ways, it may even be expected for many new businesses now. But that usually is derived partly from the influence of their family, what their family is interested in, what they consider their core values or beliefs, naturally get ingrained in the nature of the business itself. And so I think that's a very important future area for family business research, but also just in general management or entrepreneurship research as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Thank you.
So I think we had maybe it was a comment from Jay Riverside in the chat. Says, makes me think about clan theory within organizational theory. So it's not really a question, but did you have any comment on that one, Tyge?
Well, I've always thought clan theory explains a lot of things. I used to talk about that a lot. My wife is a nurse, and it's always been interesting to me how in certain organizations and nursing, and particularly in hospitals, is particularly this way, where there's a lot of clan control, where you have the expectations are controlled simply by over basically on fears of what other people might say or do or say about you or do to you. And clan control is a very prevalent thing, even on online mediums now, right? So I think there's a lot of that, but clan control works also in the family. There's a big component of that too. It would be interesting if somebody brought some of those old thoughts back and seen it if they applied to more kind of modern contexts. Might be very interesting.
Jay Riverside, did you want to unmute yourself? You had some additional follow-up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, basically, it's related to the emotional and rational aspects of the family business. I think somehow this is the values that are the inputs that are brought to the family business, I think.
No, I agree with you. I think there's a big component of the family business that has to do with the emotional or non-financial kind of aspects. And that's one of the big, over the last 10 years in the family business literature, that's been a big push, is this understanding that family business are different in many ways because they have more concern about those non-economic aspects. That isn't to say that all organizations don't have some non-financial kind of interest, but family businesses tend to be concerned more about reputation, quality, quality of life. Those types of things tend to supersede economic concerns, I guess, as long as the economics don't go too far down, right? So as long as things are going well, they'll really care about those aspects of things. But there's also been studies that show that, well, if things do get, sideways in terms of financially, economics, then the business will revert back to being a much more traditional kind of viewpoint where economics is the driving force.
Jay Riverside, anything to add on that? Should we move on to the next question? There was a question, or probably more a comment really, in the chat. In Russia, there is a tendency for business founders to exclude their sons and daughters from business and make sure the business is run by partners. Makes me think about the value of family for business in the future. So not really a question, but perhaps a comment.
Anastasia's here to ask or make comment and ask question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture and for the great atmosphere and for the opportunity to ask a question. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Russian situation. I think it's pretty unique because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had a huge amount of companies founded in the 90s, and they were all founded by young people who are now getting older. And there is a massive problem with inheritance with passing the business over to the next generations. Like it's important for so many businesses, and the mechanisms do not exist. No one knows how to do it. There is even little legislation about it, and so many companies find themselves in a mess, pretty much. For example, if a founder, the owner of the company, dies, and his sons and daughters come to the business, and they've never been in the business, they don't know anything about it, and the company just faces difficulties. So. And I talk to businessmen about it, and they say that they do not want their sons and daughters in the business. They rather prefer to have their partners and other professionals who they communicate with, who they trust, to take over the business, but not the family. and it's interesting to think what to do, what to advise to these businessmen, because the value of the family is important, and maybe we lost as a society, maybe we lost the value of the family. We don't understand how good it is to have a family running the business, for example, or it is actually a different trend, that the family and the new way of our society's organizations, that allow us to partner with other people, not with our family, to trust other people, right? To form other types of social connections and maybe build other types of social capital, not family social capital, but focus on other type, yes, organizational or business social capital. So I was just thinking about it, and yeah, from the literature I read from the West, the value of the family is unquestionable. Like the family is there, and it's as you said, a nuclear, the oldest nuclear unit. But maybe something is changing. At least in our part of the world, it's a question. Yeah,
I think that's very fascinating. I mean, this is clearly an empirical question, but I kind of wonder what the motivations are. So if they say, I don't want my children to be involved, is it because they don't trust their children to do a good job? And in that case, you say, well, you could train them, right? You bring them in early, you train them, you go through a succession plan. There's tons of literature out there about how to do succession planning and all the pitfalls that come with that. But is the question that maybe they don't want their children to do the same thing they do? Maybe they see too many negatives. Maybe they want something better for them. They want them to leave and go somewhere else to have a better life in another area. I don't know that. I think it's fascinating that you say this, because I don't know that there's something innate about blood relationships, and we probably, or at least I know with my children, I care very much about their welfare, but what I think they should do may be different than what is best for me. Maybe I think that what I'm doing them a favor by not involving them. I don't know. That I think it's a very interesting issue, but something that you could definitely dig into and maybe get some insight into kind of alternative motivations for why they would or would not involve their children in their business situation. It's very interesting. I don't have a real answer, but the succession plan, or the succession, is an ongoing and probably always will be a big problem for most family businesses globally, not just because you have a limited number of children, but they may not even be qualified to take over. For instance, I was one of 4 children, but I was the only one that went to pharmacy school. So I was the only viable candidate to take over my father's pharmacy, right? So that just by skill level. So when we had to have a very serious talk about, was I going to take over that business or not? And I didn't want to, and therefore it changed his whole demeanor about, does he want to continue forward with the business? And he sold it to a partner. So those types of issues are prevalent, I think, across the board, but you got to have serious talks, and you got to have a real structured succession plan, and it has to start early in the children's lives.
Tristan, I've asked Mohanad if you'd like actually to make a comment on that. So we have a large set of colleagues sitting here, and so I was thinking maybe Mohanad might like to make some observations that might help Anastasia, or anybody.
Yeah. Hello.
Yes, you're on. I can hear you.
I'm Mohanad. Yeah, I just wanted to ask him about his definition of social capital. So he considers the resources acquired from social relationship as social capital. Am I right?
Yes.
And Yeah, and when we speak about bridging and the linking and the how do you see this concept of this definition of social capital, bridging, linking, and bounding? How do you use them in your research, or how do you see them?
I look at those as mechanisms through which we gain social capital. So you do bonding to establish networks, relationships, whatever, ties, and those then lead to the acquisition or potential acquisition of resources or capabilities.
So bounding for you, what do you mean by bounding social capital?
Bonding. Bonding is a mechanism for social capital. So it's a way of gaining the things that we consider social capital. So bonding is a form that creates norms, values, etc. Those are the values, and the norms are the actual social capital. Bonding, and there are bonding mechanisms that lead to those types of social capital.
So when you measure social capital, what exactly you measure? Okay, resources or the what?
Well, that's a debatable issue right there. Most people in the field, when they measure quote unquote social capital, they actually just measure networks, right? They just measure the ties, so the number of ties, but that's not really the measure of social capital. That's a measure, that's a proxy. So it's a proxy for the amount. Say you have a close-knit group, you're going to assume that because it's close-knit group, we have really strong norms. If you really wanted to measure norms, you would have to measure norms, right?
Yeah.
So there's a big problem with that in the extant literature, just because there's this big assumption that if we measure the network, that's a good proxy, and it may be in many cases a proxy for the actual level of capital that we have. But without measuring it, we don't know. It's just a proxy.
For me, I'm a PhD researcher, and I use the concept of social capital to understand why some people innovate while others not. So I'm from Syria, and one of my cases is a community, an ethnic minority in Syria. They are Turkmens. So I try to measure. So last month I was in Syria, and I measured how can I say, everything I want using qualitative and quantitative methods. So I try to understand how farmers, I study farmers community, how farmers use their social networks, bounding, linking, bridging to and what kind of resources they acquire from these social relations, and how they use it. Do they use it in innovation, and how this affect their performance? So I try to understand the whole mechanism of this of the effect of social capital. Yeah, it's correct. When we have a bounding community, it's a minority and ethnic, they have a high level of bounding social capital. And I try to understand the dark and the bright side of social capital. In literature, we see that, we read that in such a community, we should have dark social capital. So they theoretically maybe they will not innovate. And I try to understand why they started to be innovative. So they try to introduce new techniques. They tried to enter new markets. Why? So after my research, I understand that right now, so there's 10 years ago, an NGO in Syria tried to support them. So in this situation, the behavior of farmers started to change from non-innovator to innovator, but not all of them started to innovate. So we have, after this integration of non-governmental organizations, some of them started to innovate while others not. So they use their bridging social capital, bridging relation, and they started to get financial and, as you said, informational and even emotional support from them. So I try to understand the whole process, the mechanism of how we get benefit from social capital. So okay. For me, I understand the dark side of social capital as well. When in family, they are family business. So their fathers, they refuse to adopt innovation, so to introduce new techniques in farming. So it's a dark side of social capital.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think that's it's a common challenge to say we have to measure our network or our relationships, and then what is the actual piece of capital that we get out of this. So we maybe have a network, a relationship to this NGO or to banks or whatever, that gives us financial capital. That's the capital we receive from the relationship. That financial capital then can be utilized to be more innovative. We can do R&D or whatever, and then that R&D will then lead to innovativeness and hopefully future performance. So you can't just say network leads to high performance. There are at least 2 steps that go in between that in the process. Yeah. And we have to measure each of those steps individually. And that's where we get into real trouble as researchers, because we tend to skip over things just because it's either hard to gather or we can't measure it easily.
Yeah. After reading your research and articles, I tried to fill this gap and to measure, to understand the mechanism and why it's, you always say that contingency theory, and we have to study the moderate variables between networks and performance. So I tried to fill this gap and hopefully to get good research. Yeah, and this is one case. Yeah, and this is one case. The other case, a small, I have 2 or 3 case studies, and the other they don't have any kind of innovation. So I will do. No, it's a little bit complicated, but. Maybe I can write through later on about this or not.
Certainly, no problem.
Okay, thank you, sir.
I think Tyge's making a really good point here about the way in which we measure social capital, because we quite often will measure things that are effectively sources of social capital, which really stand in for a proxy that social capital exists. You know, if we have the built environment, a walkable neighborhood in a certain situation, if we have, a membership in voluntary association, that's likely to create the sorts of things that we would call social capital. So it's a proxy, it stands in for it. But often we're also measuring outcomes of social capital. You know, membership in voluntary association might be considered to be an outcome. So we could measure that, and that gives an indication that social capital exists. So I think quite often when we're measuring social capital, it might be some of the source or the form or the consequence. Key thing is to be clear about what it is that we are measuring, because if we are measuring source or consequence, not what social capital actually is, then as Tyge was saying, there can be other factors that are coming into play that we're not measuring. And so we're really just making assumptions that a certain network configuration, for example, is resulting in certain types of social capital. And I think that's the danger, and what we need to do to improve the quality of our research. We need to examine those assumptions that we're making. So any other questions coming up, Marion?
No, I've actually, okay, I was actually asking some of our contributors whether or not they actually sort of had a question. And no, so there's no questions. So I guess that's open slather for you and I, Tristan.
Okay. Well, did you have any other questions, Marion?
Not at this stage. No. I've been very busy on chat. Yeah.
How are we going for time, Tyge? Because I do have at least one more question. Have you got time for a couple more?
Oh, certainly. Yes, I'm fine.
Great. So I was wondering, a really topical question at the moment is with the pandemic and people working a lot more from home, and it's one of the things that you mentioned in the presentation. How you think family businesses maybe give an advantage or a disadvantage with people working from home? And I guess the second part of the question is, with your understanding of social capital, what can businesses do to mitigate some of the disadvantages of working from home from a social capital perspective?
Okay. On the first question, I think that what I have seen is that family businesses do have a distinct advantage in the pandemic, where the pandemic had a big influence on shutdowns and the workforce problems that we've seen around here, just finding people that are willing to work, because your family, one, you get, when you get shut down or you have to be quarantined, you quarantine with your entire family. So you're already quarantined with your family. You can still work together. So you can go to the office, you can work. So if the bulk of your workforce is family, you kind of get around that. So there's some distinct advantages with that, because you're going to see each other anyway. So if you're working together, that kind of overcomes that problem. Relatedly, if a portion of your workforce is from the family, they're going to work, right? Even if you can't pay them, or even, you can even bring in extra family members to help. They're going to be more likely to work and help you overcome business problems, just because they have a relationship with you and to the business, and so there's going to be some distinct advantages. So that's probably part of the reason why family businesses tend to just be they tend to persevere, is because they have a way of overcoming some of these things just through the nature of the family and its interaction and its relationship that it has, and there's a devotion to that family that supersedes any kind of difficulty that you might have as an individual. So I think, in answer to your question, I think there's some distinct advantages to having a family business and some of the things that were going on. And I think what you'll find is there'll be a lot of family businesses that were started up as well during this time.
Absolutely. So what do you think about the second part of the question about, for businesses who are working from home, because even for family businesses, some employees are likely to be working from home and isolated from the rest of the business. With your understanding of social capital, what do you think people could do to mitigate that a bit?
That's a hard question, but people are social. I mean, that's kind of an understanding that I've come. Even though some people like to work at home and it is convenient in many ways, people still need, for the most part, still need a social outlet. So creating social opportunities, even if it's online, goes a long way of overcoming kind of isolation and problems. We're meant to be social. We get into kind of mental health issues if we're not social. So as an employer, it would be best if you made sure that people were staying engaged in some way, either through online mechanisms, or having social functions that are outside. In academia, we tend to be pretty isolated, and so we'll make it a point to get together with our research group on a regular basis just to have dinner or something. So it's important that we engage with each other on a semi-regular basis. And I think as an employer, that's an important thing that you need to implement so that people have opportunities to interact in a social setting just to maintain some of those relationships and ties. Otherwise, there won't be innovation. There won't be new ideas. Work will slip. I think we'll see a lot of negative implications from that if you don't do those things.
It seems like a lot of businesses are quite aware of this, and in the past, a lot of businesses seem to be so focused on productivity and efficiency they reduced social interaction time. Almost removed the tea room so that people couldn't go and talk and spend time socializing.
Right.
And it almost seems like the pandemic and working from home is also almost forcing some of these businesses to actually reprioritize social time. Have you seen any evidence of that happening in what you're looking at?
I think you're hitting it very squarely on the head. They're aware of these things, and they realize this is important, but at the same time, they're not sure exactly how to best go about implementing that kind of issue. And so I've seen some real challenges, but I think it has I guess some good things that have come out of this. The pandemic is we're having to reevaluate what our priorities are. And a lot of people are finding out that having relationships with people is important, and that we probably took it for granted somewhere along the way, and we need to figure out a way to do better. So
it seems like technology is a little bit of a limitation. We have this fantastic technology we're using right now to be able to communicate almost face-to-face across vast distances. What other limitations do you think there are to technology? Like if you could have any technology at all to improve social capital, what do you think that would be?
Ooh, that's a tough question. Well, I have two boys and their ages 9 and 11. And we talk about how nice it would be to be able to transport anywhere instantly. So if I was on a Star Trek or something, and we could transport instantly, that would be a great tool. Minus that, I'm thinking like virtual reality kind of situations. I think there'll continue to be some improvements in that. We've come a long way in the last couple of years just in the terms of this capability and the Zoom and people's ability to deal with it and hop on and hop off. That's been a great deal. I don't know. That's a tough question. Did you have any ideas?
Well, I think we're kind of going there, like you said, like virtual reality or perhaps augmented reality. Where we're moving beyond this single camera kind of, someone on a screen to something that's actually more immersive in our own environment. Where almost hologram kind of experiences, if it was augmented reality or actual virtual reality stuff. And I know Facebook is going that way a little bit with Meta. And I have some really big concerns about how that'll work from a social dynamics kind of point of view. But I think there's a lot of scope for technological developments to improve this. And even the way normatively that we define our meetings, we start our meeting, we get to business, maybe we have a casual chat first, but because they're online, we're often missing out on the walking into the room or going up in the lift together or over the water cooler kinds of interactions that often don't occur because we get onto a Zoom call, we get to business, we finish it, And so I think just normatively, we can do things a little bit differently, get on a little bit earlier, stay a little bit later, emphasize the social aspects of meeting times. So I think there's ways, even with current technologies, there's ways we can do things a little differently.
Right.
Aaron, was there a comment from Shirley in the chat? Was that a question?
No, that wasn't a question. And I've actually put a comment there about AI being used in the boardroom increasingly. So I guess the older generations tend to not understand the power of technology. And so maybe that's a form of capital that the younger generations have within the organizations. That's just a comment. But I did have a question for Ty. about his advice going forward, because this group is an international group. The video that we're doing now will be watched by many people. I'm pushing it out into suggesting also that teachers or lecturers, etc., use the content. So my question is, what advice would you give to somebody that was interested in researching this area going forward, Tyge?
I guess my basic advice would be go for it. I think there's a ton of opportunity here that is very applicable, and I just think there's just many avenues you could take. And so people often say, what should I study and what's going to be the next fad? I think you can find a solid theoretical foundation in the social capital literature, and there's still plenty of avenues to take that you could make a major contribution, and you can do it from a qualitative or a quantitative perspective. You can do it in multiple contexts. I just think there's just so many opportunities in this space that haven't been tapped into yet. And I would be encouraging as what I would say. No specific direction per se, but just that there's plenty of space and lots of opportunity.
I do have a final question. I'm sorry, I've asked you a lot of questions, and some of them have been really quite difficult. In a lot of the work that I do, I encourage people to become more aware of the benefit, the importance of social capital. And as soon as they do understand the value, it tends to change their behavior quite a bit. They start to connect with more people, spend more time socializing, develop stronger relationships, perhaps not betray trust as readily, be more loyal and of service to people. So do you think that's all of these things? Do you think that's part of the black box, or does it fit specifically into the theoretical approach to social capital?
I think that is part of the black box, but it also is pretty, the basic theory behind social capital is your relationships lead to good things, basically, right? Or I guess bad things too, but we're trying to get good things out of our relationships. And the relationships and the networks can be managed. And I think once people finally, if they kind of come to that realization that it's a pretty simple concept, but it has lots of layers and complexity when you really start thinking about it, it becomes very interesting to them. And I've done the same thing. If I can just get people to understand the basic concept, then it makes them rethink about all different aspects of their life, personal, business, etc. And it does change behavior, and it does really resonate with most people once they kind of get it down and really think about it.
Absolutely. And I think when you were showing a couple of slides with things that we can do to improve social capital, I think that's what was coming to mind, is like a lot of these things we already kind of know about intuitively. A lot of businesses already do a lot of these things, but understanding the value of social capital then increases the emphasis on them, the preparedness to do all of these things. And there's got to be a lot of benefits just from simply understanding the importance of it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So any final questions? I think we're getting pretty close to the 90 minutes. So leave it open for any final questions. Feel free to take yourself off mute if you would like, or pop something in the chat.
Sorry, I've just said thank you from the social capital family. Somebody labeled us that group.
Well, thank you all for your hospitality and the great questions, and for your attentiveness. It's been a pleasure. Really do. Thank you for the kind words.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tyge, on behalf of the entire group for taking the time to do this. We know how much effort you put into preparing for this kind of thing, and we really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
So I'll just end the recording now, but if everyone can just stay online, we could potentially have a couple of